The clock on the wall of the district courthouse showed 4 in the afternoon, but the air inside the room felt like it had been stagnant for a week. It was a Tuesday, which usually meant the docket was overflowing with minor disputes, traffic violations, and the kind of paperwork headaches that nobody wanted to deal with. The wooden benches were packed with people waiting for their names to be called, shifting in their seats, wiping sweat from their foreheads, and staring at the judge's bench with a mixture of fear and boredom, sitting behind the high desk. Judge Ellis looked like he had aged 10 years since the morning began. He was an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes that had seen every trick in the book. He had started his career with high hopes of fixing the legal system, but after 20 years of watching the same arguments repeat themselves, his patience had worn thin. He rubbed his temples, trying to massage away the headache that was building behind his eyes. He just wanted to clear the list. He wanted to go home, take off his heavy black robe, and sit in a quiet room. "Right," the judge said, his voice echoing through the room. "Next case. Let's move this along. We are already behind schedule." The clerk, a young woman who looked as tired as the judge, shuffled through a stack of papers. "Case number 4B, she called out. "Property Management Group versus Tenant." Daniel stood up from the very back row. He was a young man, probably in his mid-20s, with a cheap suit that didn't quite fit his shoulders right. His tie was a little too wide and his dark hair was messy, as if he had run all the way to the courthouse. He looked nothing like the expensive lawyers who usually dominated this room. He didn't have a leather briefcase or a team of assistants. He held a battered folder stuffed with loose papers, and he looked nervous. "Your Honor," Daniel said, his voice shaking slightly, "I am representing the tenant, Mr. Henderson." Judge Ellis looked over his spectacles at the young man. He sighed a long, audible exhale that signaled his frustration. He had seen hundreds of young lawyers just like this one fresh out of law school, full of ideals but completely unprepared for the reality of a courtroom. They usually wasted time with objections that didn't matter and speeches that nobody wanted to hear. "Counsel," the judge said, cutting him off before he could say another word. "I have read the summary. This is an eviction case based on non-payment and a dispute regarding property damages. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Daniel answered quickly. "But there are circumstances that I don't need the circumstances right now," the judge interrupted. He tapped his pen on the desk, a rhythmic, impatient sound. "I just want to know if we can settle this quickly or if we are going to be here until midnight. The landlord has provided records. Does your client have the money?" Daniel hesitated. He looked down at his folder, then back at the judge. "No, Your Honor, he doesn't have the full amount. But the issue is the damages. The landlord is claiming he destroyed the carpet and the plumbing, but the judge held up a hand to stop him. Then this is simple. If he can't pay and there is damage to the unit, the eviction stands. I have 10 more cases on this list." "Why are we arguing about carpets?" "Because the law says he isn't liable for those specific damages," Daniel said. He took a small step forward, trying to sound confident even though his knees felt weak. The judge raised an eyebrow. He leaned back in his chair. For a moment, the room was silent. The people in the benches stopped whispering. They all sensed that the judge's patience was running out. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone who looked like he should still be studying for exams, the law says. The judge repeated, his voice heavy with sarcasm. "Young man, the law is very clear. If you break a rental agreement, you pay. I have presided over hundreds of these cases. Please do not lecture me on the law." "I would never presume to lecture you, Your Honor," Daniel said, choosing his words carefully. "I am just saying that there is a statute that changes how liability works for maintenance issues in older buildings." At the other table, the lawyer for the property management company stood up. This man was the exact opposite of Daniel. His name was Mr. Sterling, and he wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than Daniel's car. He had a calm, arrogant smile on his face as he smoothed his tie. "Your Honor," Sterling said smoothly, "I believe the young counsel is confused. He's likely referencing a generic clause that doesn't apply here. My firm has handled over 50 evictions in this district, and the interpretation he is suggesting simply isn't how things work." Sterling's voice was polished, professional, and bored. He acted like he was doing everyone a favor just by being there. He walked toward the bench with an easy confidence, holding a single document. Judge Ellis looked at Sterling, then back at Daniel. The contrast was painful. On one side, you had a corporate veteran who looked like he belonged in a courtroom. On the other, you had a kid with a loose tie and a stack of papers. It wasn't a fair fight, and in the judge's mind, the outcome was already decided. "Mr. Sterling is correct," the judge said, already looking back down at his docket sheet. "Unless you have a binding precedent that specifically changes the standard landlord-tenant relationship, which I know you don't, I am ready to rule." "Your Honor, please," Daniel pleaded. He could feel the sweat on his back. This isn't just a standard relationship. The building in question failed to safety inspections. The statute is specific. It is Section 14B of the Housing Accountability Act. "I am going to stop you right there," the judge said, his voice turning hard. The gavel hovered in his hand. "I do not have time for law school theories. We are dealing with a simple eviction. The tenant broke the lease. The landlord wants him out. If you continue to waste the court's time with irrelevant statutes, I will hold you in contempt." The room felt incredibly cold. Daniel's heart was hammering against his ribs. He knew that if he sat down now, his client would be homeless by the weekend. He knew that the expensive lawyer, Mr. Sterling, was banking on the judge being too tired and too annoyed to look deeper. Sterling was watching Daniel with a smirk, his eyes saying, "Just give up, kid." But Daniel couldn't give up. He remembered Mr. Henderson, the tenant, an elderly man who had lived in that apartment for 20 years. He remembered the mold in the walls and the fear in the old man's eyes when he said he had nowhere else to go. Daniel had spent 3 sleepless nights reading every single housing code in the state. He knew he was right. He just had to make the judge listen. "Your Honor," Daniel said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the terror he felt, "I respectfully ask for 2 minutes. If after 2 minutes you want to rule against us, I will not say another word. But I ask that you look at the text of the act." Judge Ellis stared at him. The silence stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable. The clerk stopped typing. The security guards looked over. Everyone was waiting to see if the young lawyer would crash and burn or if he actually had something to say. The judge looked at the clock, then at the stack of files, and finally at the desperate young man standing before him. 2 minutes, the judge said, pointing a finger at him. "And if you are wrong, I am fining you for wasting this court's time. Don't test my patience today." "Thank you, Your Honor," Daniel said. He took a deep breath and opened his mouth to speak. But before he could get a single word out, Mr. Sterling interrupted again. "Your Honor, really," Sterling said, chuckling softly. "This is absurd. We are debating basic contract law. I can provide the standard ruling right now and save us all the trouble. This young man is clearly in over his head." Daniel felt a flash of anger. It wasn't right. The system wasn't supposed to be about who had the better suit or the smoother voice. It was supposed to be about the truth. He gripped the edge of his folder so hard his knuckles turned white. He knew that if he let Sterling talk again, the case would be over. He had to interrupt the interruption. He had to take a risk that might get him thrown out of the courtroom. "Objection, Your Honor." Daniel's voice rang out louder than he intended, bouncing off the wood paneling of the room. Judge Ellis froze. The gavel came down hard. "Objection? To what exactly?" "He is mischaracterizing the statute," Daniel said, his voice firm, "and he is hoping you won't check it." The room went deadly quiet. Judge Ellis looked at Daniel with a dangerous expression. He didn't like being yelled at, and he certainly didn't like a rookie accusing an established lawyer of trying to fool the court. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Everyone in the room knew that Daniel had just crossed a line. Now, it was all up to what happened next. The sound of the gavel striking the wooden block echoed through the quiet room, but it didn't settle the nerves. It only seemed to stretch the tension tighter. Everyone in the courtroom could feel that something dangerous was about to happen. Judges were used to lawyers arguing, but they were not used to being challenged directly, especially by a young man in a cheap suit who looked like he should still be in class. Judge Ellis didn't look angry anymore. He looked cold. He took off his glasses slowly and folded them, placing them gently on the desk in front of him. Then he fixed his gaze on Daniel. It was the kind of look that could make a confident man sweat. And Daniel was definitely sweating. "You were stepping onto very thin ice." "Son," the judge said, his voice low and calm, which was much worse than the shouting from before. "Mr. Sterling is a senior officer of this court. He has practiced law in this district since before you were born. And you stand there and accuse him of trying to mislead me." Daniel swallowed hard. His throat felt dry, like he had swallowed a handful of sand. He knew that if he apologized now, he would lose. If he backed down, Mr. Sterling would win, the old tenant would be evicted, and the truth would be buried under procedure. But standing his ground felt like standing in front of a firing squad. "I apologize if I sounded disrespectful, Your Honor," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "I am not accusing Mr. Sterling of lying. I am saying he is relying on an interpretation of the law that was updated 2 years ago. He is using the old version of the statute." Mr. Sterling let out a soft, dismissive laugh. He didn't even bother to look at Daniel. Instead, he addressed the judge with a smooth, confident tone, acting like Daniel was a pesky fly that needed to be swatted away. "Your Honor, this is a classic tactic," Sterling said, shaking his head. "When the facts aren't on your side, you confuse the court with technicalities. The Housing Accountability Act hasn't been substantively changed in years. He is grasping at straws because his client has no money and no defense." Daniel felt a surge of frustration. He opened his folder and pulled out a laminated sheet of paper. He knew exactly what the law said. He had spent nights reading it, highlighting it, and memorizing it while other law students were out at parties. The act was amended, Daniel insisted, taking another step toward the bench. The legislature added Section 14C, specifically shifts the burden of proof for mold and structural damage in buildings built before 1980. It was designed to stop landlords from charging tenants for normal wear and tear on systems they refuse to maintain. Judge Ellis rubbed his forehead again. He looked tired. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was already past 4:30. He had been listening to people argue all day about things that didn't matter. And now, he had a rookie lawyer telling him how to do his job. In his experience, young lawyers who cited obscure sections of the law were usually wrong. They didn't understand the spirit of the law. They just knew how to read words in a book. "Counselor," the judge said, his patience clearly gone, "I have read the Standard Housing Code 1,000 times. I know what it says. I know what the landlord's obligations are, and I know what the tenant's obligations are. I am not going to let you turn a simple eviction hearing into a law school seminar." "This is not the place for it, Your Honor," Sterling interjected, stepping forward smoothly. "I have the standard lease agreement right here. It is crystal clear. The tenant is responsible for all damages to the unit, including flooring and plumbing. That is standard contract law. If the tenant destroys property, he pays. If he can't pay, he leaves. It is that simple." Sterling held up the lease, waving it slightly as if it were the holy grail of legal documents. "We are asking for a standard judgment. The law is on our side, Your Honor. Let's not waste the afternoon on theories." Judge Ellis nodded. He looked at Daniel with a finality that made Daniel's stomach drop. "He is right, son," the judge said. "The contract is clear. You signed it, your client is bound by it. The statute you are talking about, even if it exists, does not override a signed contract in this manner. I am not going to allow you to bog down this court with arguments that will just get overturned on appeal anyway." The judge reached for his gavel. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs. He watched the judge's hand. It was over. He had lost. The system was too big, too fast, and too tired to care about the truth. Mr. Sterling adjusted his cufflink, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. He had one, just like he always did. He knew the judge didn't want to work hard. He knew the judge just wanted to go home. "Judgment for the plaintiff," the judge announced, his hand raised. "The tenant has 30 days to vacate." "Wait," Daniel shouted. The word burst out of him before he could stop it. The gavel stopped in midair. The judge's eyes widened in shock. No one yelled "wait" in a courtroom. It was disrespectful. It was outrageous. The people in the back row stopped whispering. Even the court clerk stopped typing. Mr. Sterling turned to look at Daniel, his smile gone, replaced by a look of pure annoyance. "Did you just yell in my courtroom?" the judge asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Daniel took a deep breath. He knew he was about to get kicked out. He knew he might be fined. He knew he was risking his reputation before he even really had one. But he also knew that if he sat down now, he would regret it for the rest of his life. He wasn't just fighting for a case. He was fighting for the reason he became a lawyer in the first place. "Your Honor, I am sorry," Daniel said, his voice softer but trembling with intensity. "But you are about to make a mistake based on incomplete information." Mr. Sterling is quoting the 1998 version of the code. He is ignoring the amendments passed in 2022. If you sign that order, you are evicting a man for damages that the law says he is not responsible for. The burden of maintenance is on the landlord in these specific units, Daniel continued, his words coming faster now. I have the text of the amendment right here. I have the legislative history. It says that landlords cannot claim damages for pre-existing structural decay. That is exactly what is happening here. Judge Ellis stared at the young man. He saw the desperation in Daniel's eyes. He saw the way Daniel's hands were clutching that folder like a shield. But he also saw defiance. And Judge Ellis did not like defiance. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, turning away from Daniel, "is there any validity to this? Has there been a recent change?" Mr. Sterling didn't blink. He didn't hesitate. He looked the judge right in the eye. "Your Honor, there have been minor administrative adjustments, but nothing that changes the fundamental liability of the tenant." He is referring to a footnote in a committee report that never became binding law. It is a common misunderstanding among junior lawyers. Sterling led. Daniel knew he lied. He could see it in the way Sterling's eyes flickered away for a split second. Sterling was betting that the judge wouldn't check. He was betting that his expensive suit and his seniority were worth more than the truth. "See," the judge said, turning back to Daniel, "you are chasing ghosts. I have had enough. Sit down, or I will have the bailiff remove you." Daniel looked at the judge, then at Mr. Sterling. The smug look on Sterling's face made Daniel's blood boil. He thought about the old man, Mr. Henderson, who would be sleeping on the street in a month because of this lie. He thought about how unfair the world was when a man in a nice suit could just make things up. Everyone would believe him. Daniel didn't sit down. Instead, he stood up straighter. He reached into his folder and pulled out a single photocopied page. It was wrinkled and highlighted in yellow. "Your Honor," Daniel said, his voice surprisingly steady now. "I am not going to sit down, and I am not going to let you rule until you see this. You keep saying you know the law, but do you know who wrote the amendment?" The judge paused. "What does that have to do with anything?" "It matters," Daniel said, his eyes locking onto the judge's. "Because the person who wrote the law is standing in front of you. And I am telling you, Mr. Sterling is wrong." A hush fell over the room. It was such a bold statement that for a second nobody reacted. The judge looked at Daniel, really looked at him for the first time. He saw the cheap suit, the messy hair, and the burning confidence in the young man's eyes. The arrogance of the statement hung in the air. The kid was claiming to be the author of the law. It sounded impossible. It sounded like a desperate lie, but it stopped the gavel from falling. The judge slowly lowered his hand. He looked at Mr. Sterling, who was suddenly shifting his weight from foot to foot, looking a little less comfortable. Then the judge looked back at Daniel. "Are you telling me," the judge said slowly, "that you personally wrote this amendment? You expect me to believe that?" Daniel took a step forward and placed the paper on the ledge of the judge's bench. "Yes, Your Honor. I worked on the drafting committee 2 years ago. I wrote Section 1 for C myself. And if you read it, you will see that Mr. Sterling's client has no case." For a long moment, nobody moved. The air in the courtroom felt electric. The outcome of the entire day, the entire case, and maybe the entire future of a young lawyer hung on what happened in the next 10 seconds. The judge looked down at the paper, his eyes scanning the text. The silence was deafening. "All right," the judge whispered, more to himself than to the room. Let's see what you have. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vent near the ceiling. It was a low, steady drone that seemed to amplify the tension in the room. Every single person was holding their breath. The bailiff, who usually looked like he was half asleep against the wall, was standing up straight now, his eyes fixed on the judge's bench. Even the people waiting in the back for their own traffic tickets had stopped looking at their phones. They all knew something strange was happening. Judge Ellis looked down at the wrinkled piece of paper Daniel had placed on the dark wood of his desk. He didn't pick it up immediately. Instead, he looked over his spectacles at Daniel with a glare that could cut through glass. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that makes you swallow hard just to break the pressure in your own ears. "Young man," the judge said, his voice dangerously soft. "Do you have any idea how serious it is to make a claim like that in a court of law? You are telling me that you personally authored a state statute?" In the middle of an eviction hearing, Daniel stood his ground, though his hands were shaking so badly he had to clasp them behind his back to hide them. "Yes, Your Honor, I know how it sounds. But before I passed the bar exam, I worked as a legislative aide for the State Housing Committee. I spent 18 months drafting and redrafting the specific amendments that Mr. Sterling is pretending don't exist." Mr. Sterling let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. He didn't bother to hide his amusement this time. He turned to the audience, throwing his hands up as if to say, "Asterisk, can you believe this guy?" Then he turned back to the bench, his face twisting into a sneer. "Your Honor?" "This is ridiculous," Sterling said, his voice dripping with contempt. "This is nothing more than a desperate stunt to delay an inevitable eviction. He is confusing his law school homework with actual legislation. We are wasting the court's time with fantasy." "Quiet," Judge Ellis snapped. He didn't look at Sterling. He was still staring at Daniel. The judge picked up the paper. He adjusted his glasses and squinted at the text. It was a photocopy of a legislative bill, complete with annotations and handwritten notes in the margins. The handwriting was neat, small, and precise. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, not looking up from the document, "are you telling me that this document is a fake?" "I am telling you it is irrelevant," Sterling shot back. "Even if it is a real bill from some committee, that doesn't mean it became law. Hundreds of bills are written every year and never get passed. This is just a proposal. It has no weight in this court." "Does it have the governor's signature on it?" the judge asked, his finger tracing a line near the bottom of the page. "Your Honor, please," Sterling said, stepping closer to the bench, trying to block the judge's view of Daniel. "I have the current code right here. I have the digital subscription service. This is what judges and lawyers use. This kid has a piece of paper. Are we really going to prioritize a crumpled photocopy over established legal databases?" Judge Ellis finally looked up from the paper. He looked at Mr. Sterling, and then he looked at the expensive leather briefcase sitting on Sterling's table. He looked at Daniel, standing there in his cheap suit with nothing but a folder full of loose papers. It was a classic mismatch. On one side, there was money, power, and technology. On the other, there was just truth. "Approach the bench," the judge said. Both lawyers walked forward. Mr. Sterling moved with the confidence of a man who owned the room. Daniel walked with the heavy steps of someone walking to the gallows. They stood in the well of the court, facing the judge. "Counsel," the judge said, speaking directly to Sterling, "you are moving for dismissal based on the premise that the tenant is liable for structural damages under the standard code." "That is correct." "Your Honor," Sterling said smoothly. "And you," the judge said, turning his sharp gaze to Daniel, "you are claiming that this specific piece of paper, this Section 14C, removes that liability." "Yes, Your Honor," Daniel said. He felt a small spark of hope. The judge was reading it. He was actually reading it. Please look at the third paragraph. It specifically addresses buildings built before 1985. It says that landlords cannot pass the cost of essential plumbing repairs to tenants if the building has failed. To safety inspections in the last year. Mr. Henderson's building failed 3 inspections last year alone, Sterling scoffed. That interpretation is absurd. It would bankrupt the housing industry. Your Honor, the digital code does not reflect this. That, Daniel said, turning to face the older lawyer. It's because the database hasn't been updated since the special session ended 2 months ago. Liar, Sterling said, dropping his smooth persona for a split second. I checked it yesterday. Check the legislative journal, Daniel fired back. It was published last Friday. Judge Ellis held up a hand to stop them from arguing. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had seen too many people lie to him. But he also looked curious. He went back to the paper Daniel had given him. He read the annotations in the margin. He saw the notes that said, Intent. Protect low-income tenants from predatory repair charges. Your Honor, Daniel said softly. I wrote that note in the margin. I wrote that intent statement because I didn't want exactly this to happen. I didn't want landlords to use the law to kick people out of homes they couldn't afford to fix. The judge stopped reading. He looked at Daniel for a long moment. For the first time all day, he didn't see a rookie lawyer. He saw a human being who cared deeply about what he was doing. The arrogance of youth was gone, replaced by a quiet, desperate sincerity. If you are lying to me, the judge whispered, I will ensure you never practice law in this state. Daniel didn't flinch. I am not lying, Your Honor. The judge tapped the paper on the desk. Then he did something that shocked everyone in the room. He opened his own drawer and pulled out a thick, heavy book. It was the official annotated state statutes, a real, physical book that sat on his desk mostly for decoration. Most judges use the computer these days, but the book was the ultimate backup. I'm going to read the amendment, the judge announced. And if I find that this 1(c) exists and says what this young man says it says, Mr. Sterling, we are going to have a very different conversation. Mr. Sterling's face went pale. The confident smirk vanished. He shifted his weight, looking nervously at the paper in the judge's hand. Your Honor, that book is outdated. It takes months to print a new edition. Then explain this to me, the judge said, flipping through the heavy pages until he found the section on housing. He ran his finger down the page, muttering to himself, 14A? 14B? 14C? The room was so quiet that the rustle of the heavy paper sounded like a thunderclap. Daniel stopped breathing. He watched the judge's eyes move back and forth across the text. He saw the judge's eyebrows rise up, just a fraction of an inch. Then the judge reached over and picked up Daniel's photocopy again. He compared the two. The judge looked at the book. Then he looked at the copy. Then he looked at Mr. Sterling. It appears, the judge said slowly, his voice filled with a heavy, surprising weight, that the database Mr. Sterling relies on is indeed behind schedule. Because this book, this physical, updated supplement, contains the exact section the young man is talking about. Sterling took a step back, his mouth opening slightly. He looked like he had just been punched in the stomach. But that can't be. It wasn't in the email alert. I don't care about email alerts, the judge said, his voice suddenly booming. He slammed the heavy book shut, the sound making everyone in the courtroom jump. I care about the law, and I care about the truth. Judge Ellis looked down at Daniel. The annoyance was gone. The impatience had vanished, replaced by a look of grudging respect. You were right to stand your ground, the judge said. But you were very close to being held in contempt. Don't ever yell at me again. Daniel let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for an hour. I won't, Your Honor. Mr. Sterling, the judge said, turning his cold gaze to the expensive lawyer. It seems you attempted to use the court's ignorance of a recent amendment to win a case you should have lost. Is that the kind of lawyer you are? I was acting on the information I had, Your Honor, Sterling stammered. He looked small now. His suit didn't look so expensive anymore. He just looked like a man who had been caught cutting corners. Well, you have new information now, the judge said. He picked up his gavel. The tension in the room snapped back to attention. Everyone leaned forward. The old people, the security guards, the clerk. They all waited for the final word. The motion to dismiss the tenant's counterclaim is denied. The judge ruled, striking the gavel against the wood with a sharp crack. In fact, based on Section 14C, it appears the landlord is the one who owes the tenant for the repairs they illegally charged him for. A cheer went up from the back of the room. It wasn't loud, but it was a collective gasp of relief. Daniel smiled, his shoulders finally dropping as the weight of the world lifted off them. Case continued for calculation of damages, the judge said. And young man? Daniel looked up, startled. Yes, Your Honor. In my chambers, the judge said, standing up. Now. The judge walked through the door behind the bench, leaving the room in a buzz of whispers. Daniel stood there for a second, stunned. He had won. He actually won. But he wasn't out of the woods yet. He looked at the heavy wooden door where the judge had disappeared. He took a deep breath, straightened his cheap tie, and walked toward the door, ready for whatever came next. The door to the judge's chambers was heavy and made of dark oak. With a brass handle that looked cold to the touch, Daniel stood in front of it for a moment, his heart still hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Behind him, the main courtroom was buzzing with the low hum of people whispering. Excited about the sudden turn of events they had just witnessed, Mr. Sterling was hurriedly shoving his papers into his briefcase, his face red with embarrassment, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Daniel took a deep breath and turned the handle. The door clicked open, and he stepped inside. The room was much quieter than the courtroom. It smelled of old books, leather furniture, and stale coffee. It was a comfortable office, lined with shelves full of legal binders that went all the way to the ceiling. There were heavy curtains drawn over the windows, blocking out the afternoon sun. In the center of the room, Judge Ellis was sitting in a high-backed leather chair, pouring water from a pitcher into a glass. Close the door, the judge said without looking up. Daniel pushed the door shut until it clicked. The silence in the room was heavy, but it wasn't the angry silence of the courtroom. It was a thoughtful silence. Daniel walked over to the chair in front of the judge's desk. He sat down on the edge, feeling small and out of place in the grand office. Judge Ellis took a sip of his water and then leaned back, studying the young man sitting across from him. The angry impatience was gone from his face. In its place was a look of genuine curiosity. He took off his reading glasses and set them down on a stack of files. "Do you have any idea?" the judge began, his voice calm and measured. "How many lawyers come into my courtroom and try to argue about the law without actually knowing it?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "No, sir. Hundreds," the judge said. "Maybe thousands. They argue about feelings. They argue about fairness. They argue about technicalities that don't exist. But today was different." The judge reached over and picked up the photocopy of the amendment that Daniel had handed him in court. He tapped his finger on it. "You told me you wrote this," the judge said. "Yes, Your Honor," Daniel answered, his voice quiet but steady. The judge leaned forward. "Why? I've read the text. It's dense, complicated language. It changes liability for decades of housing code. Why would a young lawyer spend his time writing something like this?" Daniel looked down at his hands. They were scarred from working manual labor jobs during college to pay for his tuition. He thought about his mother, who had been evicted from an apartment when he was a boy because of a leaky pipe the landlord refused to fix. He remembered the panic of packing boxes in the middle of the night. "Because the law was broken, Your Honor," Daniel said simply. "I saw families losing their homes over damages they didn't cause. I saw landlords using the system to punish people for getting old or getting sick. The law was supposed to protect people, but it was being used to hurt them. I wanted to fix it." Judge Ellis didn't say anything for a long time. He just watched Daniel. He had been a judge for a long time, and he had become used to lawyers who were in it for the money. They chased the big cases, the corporate clients, the fame. They wore tailored suits and drove expensive cars. But looking at Daniel in his ill-fitting suit, with his messy hair and his honest eyes, he saw something rare. He saw someone who actually cared about the people behind the case numbers. "You took a huge risk out there," the judge said. "You were disrespectful. You interrupted a senior officer of the court. You yelled at me. If you had been wrong, I would have disbarred you. I would have ended your career before it even started." "I know," Daniel whispered. "Was it worth it?" The judge asked. "For a rental dispute. For an eviction case." Daniel looked up, and his eyes were bright. "Yes, because Mr. Henderson is sleeping in his own bed tonight. And tomorrow, he doesn't have to worry about where he is going to go. That is worth everything to me." Judge Ellis nodded slowly. A small smile appeared on his face, softening the hard lines of weathered features. He stood up and walked over to the window, pulling back the curtain just a little to let a sliver of light into the room. "You know," the judge said, his back to Daniel, "when I was your age, I thought I could save the world too. I thought that if I just knew the law better than anyone else, justice would always win. But then you sit on the bench for 20 years. You see the same people making the same mistakes. You see the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. It makes you tired. It makes you cynical." He turned back to face Daniel. "It makes you look at a young man in a cheap suit and assume he doesn't know what he's doing. For that, I owe you an apology." Daniel's eyes went wide. He sat up straighter. "Your Honor, you don't need to. I do," the judge interrupted gently. "I judged you by your cover, Daniel. I judged you by your suit and your age. I almost let a man who knew the law less than you do win the case because he looked the part. That was my failure, and you were brave enough to stop me." The judge walked back to his desk and picked up a pen. He signed something on a piece of paper and slid it across the desk toward Daniel. Daniel picked it up. It was a note acknowledging the correct application of Section 14C in the case. But at the bottom, the judge had added a handwritten note. Asterisk, counsel displayed exceptional knowledge of statutory law and commendable courage. Asterisk, keep that, the judge said. There will be days when you doubt yourself. There will be days when you lose cases. You should have one. On those days, take this out and read it. Remember that you stood your ground when it mattered. Daniel stared at the paper. He felt a lump in his throat. He had expected a lecture, or maybe even a warning. Instead, he was getting respect from a man he admired. "Thank you, Your Honor," Daniel managed to say. The judge walked around the desk and extended his hand. Daniel stood up and shook it. The judge's grip was firm and warm. "Now," the judge said, his voice returning to a more businesslike tone, "don't let it go to your head. Next time, be polite. You don't have to yell to be heard. You have the truth on your side. That should be enough." Daniel nodded. "I will remember that." As Daniel turned to leave, the judge called his name one last time. "Daniel." Daniel turned back. "Yes, sir." "That amendment you wrote," the judge said, tapping the book on his desk. "The language in the third paragraph? It's brilliant. It closes the loophole perfectly. If you ever get tired of fighting evictions, come see me. I could use a law clerk who actually knows how to write." Daniel couldn't stop the smile from spreading across his face. "I might take you up on that, Your Honor." "Go on," the judge said, waving his hand toward the door. "Get out of here, and go tell your client he can stay." Daniel walked out of the office and closed the door behind him. The air in the hallway felt lighter. The pressure in his chest was gone. He walked back toward the courtroom with a spring in his step that hadn't been there when he walked in. He felt tall. He felt strong. He knew that the road ahead would still be hard. He would still face lawyers like Mr. Sterling. He would still face judges who were tired and impatient. But he also knew something now that he didn't fully realize before. He knew that the law wasn't just a weapon for the powerful. It was a shield for the weak. And he knew how to use it. As he pushed open the doors to the courtroom, the noise of the world rushed back in the shuffling papers. The ringing phones, the murmuring voices. But it didn't bother him anymore. He wasn't just a kid in a cheap suit anymore. He was a lawyer, and he was ready. The heavy doors of the courthouse swung open, and Daniel stepped out into the cool evening air. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the concrete steps. It had been a long day, one of the longest of his life. But as he stood there taking a deep breath, he didn't feel tired anymore. He felt light. The weight that had been pressing down on his shoulders for months was gone. Behind him, the massive building loomed tall and imposing, made of stone and glass, representing the power and the tradition of the legal system. It was a place that could crush people if they weren't careful. But today, Daniel realized the system had actually worked. Not because of the fancy lawyers or the expensive suits, but because someone had bothered to learn the rules and then had the courage to speak up. He sat down on the top step of the courthouse, loosening his tie. The cheap fabric of his suit felt scratchy against his skin, But for the first time, he didn't mind wearing it. He looked down at his hands. They weren't shaking anymore. A few hours ago, holding a simple piece of paper had felt like holding a ticking bomb. Now it just felt like paper. But it was paper that had changed a life. The doors opened again, and a small group of people walked out. In the middle of them was Mr. Henderson. The old man looked like he had aged a decade in just a few hours. He was thin and frail, wearing a coat that was too thin for the chilly weather. But when he saw Daniel sitting on the steps, his face lit up. It was a look of pure, unfiltered relief. "Daniel," the old man called out, his voice cracking a little. He hurried down the steps as fast as his legs could carry him. Daniel stood up to meet him. "Mr. Henderson, it's over. You can go back home." The old man stopped in front of him, his eyes welling up with tears. He reached out and grabbed Daniel's hands, holding them tight. "I didn't think. I thought for sure they were going to put me out on the street. I was packing my boxes this morning. I was saying goodbye to my neighbors." "You don't have to pack," Daniel said, smiling gently. "The judge ruled in your favor. And not just that. The property management company has to pay back the money they deducted from your account for those repairs." Mr. Henderson let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He squeezed Daniel's hands. "That boy. That fancy lawyer. He tried to make me feel like I was stupid. Like I didn't know how to read a contract. But you stood up to him. You stood up to the judge." "I just knew the rules, Mr. Henderson," Daniel said. "I wrote them. Remember?" The old man laughed, wiping a tear from his cheek with a rough sleeve. Yes. You told me. But still, son, you did something brave. You fought for me when nobody else would." They stood there for a moment, the noise of the city traffic humming in the background. It wasn't a big, dramatic movie moment. There was no swelling music or cheering crowd. It was just two people standing on concrete steps, sharing a quiet moment of victory. But for Daniel, it meant everything. This was why he had suffered through law school. This was why he stayed up late reading boring statutes. It was for this exact handshake. As they walked down the steps together, toward the street, Daniel thought about the day. He thought about Mr. Sterling. He had seen the older lawyer leaving through a side door earlier, looking like he wanted to be invisible. Sterling hadn't even packed his briefcase properly. He had just shoved his papers in and stormed off. He had lost, not because he didn't know the law, but because he underestimated someone. He thought the law was a club you could use to beat people into submission. He forgot that the law was also a shield. A black town car pulled up to the curb. It was sleek and shiny, reflecting the streetlights. Mr. Henderson stopped walking. He looked at the car, then at Daniel. "That young man, Mr. Sterling, Mr. Henderson," said quietly. "He drove away in a car like that. I could never afford a lawyer like him. If you hadn't been there, I don't know what I would have done." Daniel looked at the reflection of his own face in the dark window of the passing cars. He saw the messy hair and the cheap suit. He knew that to the world, he looked like a nobody. He knew that if he walked into a high-end firm right now, the receptionist would probably offer him coffee instead of a job. But that didn't matter anymore. "You don't need a lawyer like him, Mr. Henderson," Daniel said. "You need a lawyer who knows what matters." He hailed a taxi for the old man and helped him into the back seat. Mr. Henderson rolled down the window. "Come by for dinner sometime?" the old man insisted. "I make a mean stew." "It's the least I can do." "I'll take you up on that," Daniel promised. He watched the taxi pull away into the traffic. Blending in with the hundreds of other red taillights, Daniel stood alone on the sidewalk now. He buttoned his jacket against the wind. He looked back up at the courthouse one last time. The lights in the courtroom windows were flickering off for the night. Judge Ellis was probably gone by now. Probably sitting in his quiet living room. Maybe thinking about the rookie lawyer who yelled at him. Daniel hoped that maybe, just maybe, the judge was smiling too. He realized then that being a lawyer wasn't about being the smartest person in the room. It wasn't about knowing the most words or having the best clothes. It was about connection. It was about using your voice for people who couldn't use theirs. Daniel had been scared to death today. His heart had never beaten so fast. He had risked his career and his reputation. But looking at the empty spot where Mr. Henderson's taxi had been, he knew he would do it again in a heartbeat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the note Judge Ellis had given him. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was neat and sharp. Asterisk counsel displayed exceptional knowledge of statutory law and commendable courage. Asterisk Daniel smiled, folding the note back up and tucking it safely into his wallet. It was a good note to keep. But he knew he didn't really need the paper to remember the lesson. The lesson was in the way his hands didn't shake anymore. It was in the confidence he felt when he straightened his tie. He turned his back on the courthouse and started walking toward the subway station. The city noise was loud, and chaotic horns honking, people shouting, sirens wailing. It was the sound of the real world, messy and unpredictable. But as he walked down the street, Daniel didn't feel overwhelmed by it. He felt like a part of it. He had walked into that building as a scared kid who looked like he didn't belong. He was walking out as a man who knew exactly who he was. He wasn't just a public defender with a cheap suit anymore. He was a shield. And tomorrow, when the sun came up, he would be ready to fight for the next person who needed him. He adjusted his folder under his arm, stepped down into the subway station, and disappeared into the crowd, just one more face in the busy city. But he was a face that mattered, and that was the real victory.